So the rectification of names, number 2, the rectification of names in the Xunzi. Last time I speculated that the rectification of names advocated by Confucius had 2 aspects. One being that it involved a recalling to the true nature of things, in that name and nature are linked. Words are natural, and they are intimately linked with the nature of things. The second relates to the magic of names, in that they have an authority. They bring about realities. They change things. But the first of these proposals, that names are natural and linked in a hard and fast way to some reality, was not accepted by the later writer Xunzi, the master Xun. In fact, he explicitly objected to it. The Xunzi was written in the 3rd century BC, and he is regarded as one of the great Confucian thinkers, having a significant influence on later legal and political thinking in China. So the Xunzi objects to the idea that names are there by nature, an assumption which I've speculatively attributed to Confucius. We may have to change the names, according to the Xunzi. In a long passage on naming, section 22, he says the following: names have no intrinsic appropriateness. One agrees to use a certain name and issues an order to that effect, and if the agreement is abided by and becomes a matter of custom, then the name may be said to be appropriate. But if people do not abide by the agreement, then the name ceases to be appropriate. Names have no intrinsic reality. So in my view, he's making a correction and asserting that there is no givenness about names. He makes a sensible point that if the meaning of the word is respected, then it's satisfactory and can continue to be used. But if the reality under the word is distorted or decays, then the name becomes inappropriate. It seems to me that Confucius is saying that the name is always appropriate, and that simply asserting it is enough to bring social reality back to what it should be. But for the Xunzi, names are merely conventions. This issue of nature versus convention is also the subject of Plato's Cratylus, and the idea of the name has a long history in pagan and Christian Platonism thereafter. But what I've said about names being merely conventional for the Xunzi should be qualified, because he goes on to say that some names should be regarded as good names. Quoting, names which are clear, simple, and not at odds with the thing they designate may be said to be good names. By good, he must mean that these names have some correctness about them, or does he simply mean that they are highly communicative, that they just work? I find it hard to believe that he thinks that names are purely conventional, and that there is no element of the natural order in them. Though one could pursue this view of the issue and argue that the goodness of these names purely refers to their goodness in conventional discourse. That is, that they are effective and clear in communication. One could take that interpretation. This whole passage of the Xunzi reflects a discussion obviously going on behind the scene on the logic of names, which deals with the question of homonyms, for example. That is the situation where two different realities have the one name. The purpose of language and the functioning of language was obviously being vigorously discussed in the backdrop to this writing. In all this emphasis on the clarity of language and correctness of names, the Xunzi maintains the original principle of Confucius, that confusion in language eventually leads to social chaos. Nowadays, men are careless in abiding by established names. Strange words come into use, he says. Names and realities become confused, and the distinction between right and wrong has become unclear. Thus the Master Xun. He clearly feels that he's living in a different context from Confucius, who seemed to think that the simple recalling of the names would lead to the clarification of social realities. But the Xunzi finds himself in a much more relativist world, where things are changing. Language is changing. New words are being invented, and meanings are being lost. This might sound familiar. So the difference here is that a kind of job on the purification of language is called for. There is a task to be carried out on language and its clarity. And in these times, it's not simply sufficient to call for the restoration of names. And the argumentation of the Xunzi clearly reflects a lively debate in his own time about the function of language, and in particular nouns. Adjectives don't figure much. What is also clear is that the job of the purification of language is essential to government. Clear language is the prime instrument of the ruler in conveying his wishes and in explaining exactly what he wants done. So the rectification of names becomes a political technique in the writing called the Xunzi, and as many want to point out, it becomes an issue of social control and a technique of management. But before we jump quickly into the accusations of authoritarianism and social manipulation, we should carefully look at the words of the Xunzi. There's a great emphasis on clarity. He says the following words: "Therefore, the enlightened ruler controls them, the subjects, with power, guides them with the way, encourages their advancement with commands, brings enlightenment to them through the teaching of ethical relations, and prohibits evil through punishments. Hence his people are converted to the way, as though by supernatural power. What need has he of persuasive speaking? Now we live in bad times," he says, "and nobody knows what words mean. New words have been invented, and disorder is everywhere. Consequently, people in politics have to resort to persuasive speaking. But this, of course, is not his ideal. The ideal is the king who speaks plainly and clearly, and gives words their proper meaning, as well as guiding people into the way. It's the simplicity of the ruler, his honesty, clarity, and frankness, which brings about the assent of the people and their acceptance of his rule, as if by magic, as he says. So while we may ruminate on the authoritarian character of the rule in question, we can only praise the ambition for clarity of language and be reassured by the idea that it will bring about the assent of the people, who are subject to his rule. There is, of course, a clear class structure which is to be reinforced by such clear language and by the proper use of nouns. Clear language will distinguish between men of distinction and men of no account, says the Master Xun. So, of course, yes, there is a feudal class structure which is to be reinforced. But you can't have everything. At least the subjects are getting clarity of language and they can understand what they are being told. If it is characteristic of a good king to exhibit this clarity of language and clarity of intention, that at least makes a change from ideological talk or the subterfuge of spin. One last point which fascinates me is that in the same passage, the Xunzi says, names are used when the reality itself is not clearly understood. And then, of course, we sometimes need strings of names, explanations, and so on. I've been understanding this talk of names as really being about nouns. And it is striking to see that we only need a name or a noun when we don't understand the thing we are referring to or seeing with our eyes. This sentence seems to suggest that there is a way of understanding without language, and that language only comes in as a prop to enable us to communicate about what we don't understand. Perhaps we hear it or see it or feel it, but we don't understand it, so we give it a name to talk about it. An essential human activity devised to help deal with our unknowingness and possibly inferior to another way of understanding. But this also suggests that when we talk, we don't know what we are talking about. Language is a sign of unknowing. That sounds right to me. So thank you for joining me, and in the next session, I'll discuss the giving of gifts in the Confucian perspective.